industry today. So there are 5 main companies: Nichia, Osram, Cree, Toyota Gosai, and Philips Lumileds. And these 5 companies basically own the vast majority of the intellectual property in the industry. And very early on, they had almost a war to the death over lawsuits. And the result was that basically all 5 of these companies cross-license their patents. So they won't sue each other. But they do sue anybody new who comes in. And so what you end up having is, you can see there are certain groups that are aligned with other groups. There's some that have patent disputes, lawsuits, and then there's some that, for instance, there are some Taiwanese companies that are allied with Nichia in Japan. And basically they will use Nichia's intellectual property, and they use Nichia's cross-license with other companies to prevent themselves from getting sued. But if you try to enter the LED industry, you will get sued. On the very first day you put a product out that will infringe, because it has to infringe in order to be made, you'll get sued, unless you have already worked out how that works. And so I've also noted here all the Taiwan companies. This is miscellaneous, because this is 2005, and there's actually a whole bunch of other quite large now Taiwanese LED companies that are not on this particular chart. And I can show you this later if you're really interested in it. So one of the things that Taiwanese companies are then trying to do is they try to build up as many patents of their own as possible. And the idea is that then when they get sued, not if they get sued in this industry, when they get sued, they can come back to the person suing them and say, look, you're saying that I'm violating your patent, but hey, your patents actually are probably violating 40 or 50 of my own. Of course, my patents are very small patents. They're not very useful, but it's still a violation. And the idea is that if you have enough of them, the theory is if you have enough of them, you can fund the attack. You can defend against it, and force the other side to be willing to sit down at a bargaining table and come up with one of these cross-licensing agreements, instead of ending up in court and losing money, at least on lawyer fees, even if you win. Okay. So IP is property, and property is communication. So this section is an exploration of the ways. Okay, sorry. So this section is an exploration of the ways that seeing IP as communication might help us to understand it better. Then also, how this perspective might begin to fail. So property for anthropology and legal scholars is seen as a bundle of rights. It's seen primarily as relationships. One consequence of this perspective is that property can be seen as a process more similar to communication than a static state of ownership. So first of all, let me use an example to kind of explain a little bit more of what I mean by a bundle of rights. So in Taiwan, in the Qing Dynasty at least, and other parts of Fujian at least also, there was a property regime called Yitian, and I'm actually adding Jiayi +1. Because the way this system works is that you have a big landlord, a small landlord, and a renting farmer. And you could have no small landlord in some cases, you could have no small landlord and no renting farmer in some cases. But the idea is that the same piece of land is actually owned by 3 people. It's just these 3 people, or these 3 families actually, own different rights to that same land. So the big landlord probably owns, I think you could say he owns the subsoil rights. He owns the right to buy and sell this land. The small landlord is actually also buys the land from the big landlord, probably for 3 or 5 years, I think, at a time. And they're responsible for paying taxes to the government. So the big landlord just makes the money and doesn't have to pay taxes in most cases. And the small landlord ends up paying the taxes. But the small landlord also gets yearly rent from the actual farmer who's working on the land. So again, the idea is that on the same piece of land, you have a right to own it, you have a right to use it, you have a right to farm it. And in some cases, the renting farmer might have the right to build a house on that land. In some cases, that land is specified only for farming. In some cases, you have the right to grow rice on that land, but you don't have the right to change it into a vegetable plot. So basically, the idea of a bundle of rights is that for this same piece of land, you have multiple rights that we then tie together And we say, as a whole, this is ownership. So then what about property as communication? So kind of sticking with the same example, who actually owns the land? So for the Chinese case, we might say the father owns the land, the head of the household owns the land, because the head of the household gets to decide how it's used. The problem with this conception is that actually the head of the household doesn't get to decide when it's sold, or actually doesn't completely get to decide when it's sold. So I think for the Chinese case, it's generally assumed that it's actually the jia, the family, that owns the land. And that brings in, the idea of the jia brings in aspects of lineage and other people into this equation as well. So for instance, if the father wants to sell the land, when you're writing up a contract, you will definitely have to have the names of all of the sons signing onto the contract, agreeing to it. Because the sons are the people who are supposed to control the land next. And you probably also, if you're selling the land outside of a lineage, you probably also have to have the big members of the lineage there signing on as well, saying this is okay, we're agreeing with this. So the idea here is that in order to exert property rights, you have to claim that this is your right to do this. You don't automatically have the right to sell the land. You have to make an argument for it, in a sense. And other people will probably make an argument against you. So this is also clear when we talk about fenjia. So of course everybody knows when a Chinese family fenjia, the idea is that all the brothers get an equal share. But what is an equal share? I mean, there's plenty of arguments over if it was just an easy divided in three for three brothers, we're fine. You wouldn't have a lot of arguments over it, but there are plenty of arguments that happen over fenjia. And the idea is that the oldest son might say that I've been here the longest, and I've been working in the family company, I should have the rights to take the company over in its entirety. And I'll buy out, I'll give you cash for the other stuff. Or one person might say, I get the house. Or another person might say, I get all of the farmland. And so all of this stuff is a matter of claim making and counterclaim making. And another example I could go into would be about Sufangqian, or in South Africa, issues of fence making and taking down fences, tearing down fences and putting them up as a way of marking out or making a claim, staking a claim to land. Okay, so I hope that gives a little bit of an idea of what I mean by property as a communication. So one problem, though, with focusing on relationships is that basically the idea of looking at property as communication is focusing on how the owner is making a claim to a particular audience. And then the audience is making a claim back, or a counterclaim back to the owner. So one brother is making a claim to ownership over the house, and the other brother is saying, no, I actually own half this house. And so it's a counterclaim back and forth. And it's usually about an object. The problem is that when we focus on the relationships, sometimes the object itself melts away. But for owners and the audience, the zhongdian, the main point, is still the content of the property itself. So this is kind of, in a sense, I think this relationship of the owner to the audience is communication, and the owner to the object, or the audience to the object is ownership, is somewhat similar to Marx's idea of use value and exchange value. And the idea that if we really want to understand this system, we have to look at both at the same time. And I think this three-part model of object, owner, and audience as itself property, it gives us a way to understand how intangible things actually can be owned as property. So can we see intangible things, or the ownership of a patent, for instance, as communication? What are some of the consequences of patents as they are enacted and negotiated on a day-to-day level? And how is knowledge made into property? Or how does it circulate within and between companies? Okay. So patents as communication. So when we think of what a patent is, we think it refers to some kind of intangible idea. Yet this is just one part of it. Patents are actually also tangible written documents, or at least PDFs now. They have their own sets of forms and conventions that can serve as an artifact that gives us clues as to the many sets of decisions and negotiations and work that went into turning an idea into an object of property. And therefore, they give us a much better understanding of what a patent actually is. So this particular patent is one of the key patents covering the technology to make LEDs that give off blue light. So while there have been red light LEDs